And thanks everyone for being here with us. I hope you are all enjoying this annual meeting and had time to grab something to eat during the break. So thanks for joining From Facts to Feeling, using storytelling for human rights advocacy. So as Manal mentioned, I'm Caroline Brodeur. I work with Oxfam, and I'm very excited to dive into the presentations and the discussion we've planned. It is a very rich panel that we have gathered for you today. Our objective for this session will be to learn how our presenters have used storytelling in their work. We will explore different approaches to storytelling and promoting human rights. We will also exchange on strategies to increase the impact of storytelling in advocacy. So we're super interested in seeing how a powerful story can move audiences from fact to feeling and hopefully to action. Briefly, so we will first hear from Brian Rawson, who will set the table as he will help us understand how to capture the attention and commitment from our audiences and how to use it to make it more impactful in our advocacy work. Then Michael Clements from Lawyers for Human Rights will provide us with a very powerful case where her organization have amplified the voices and stories of women affected by mine closure in South Africa. Next, we will hear from Andrew Bogrand from Oxfam, who will present us Down the Line, an ongoing campaign to share the real experiences of women and men living in Uganda's oil frontier. Lastly, but not least, Paul Redman will share with us how to support environmental leadership from Indigenous peoples and local communities to build networks and cultivate inclusive, impact-driven storytelling. So once we have heard from our four speakers, we will open the floor for discussion exchanges between panelists and with you all. Two little points, so there's no obligation at all, but if that works for you with your networks and you're comfortable with it, please feel free to open your camera. Our speakers would love to see who they're talking to, but no obligation. Also, feel free to type your question in the chat throughout the session. And you can also raise your hand to ask questions during the Q&A. So now, without further delay, let me introduce you right away to our first speaker, Brian Rawson. So Brian specializes in leadership training and program design for social impact. He is a founder and board member of Action Corps and a trainer at Life Labs Learning. He led US-based grassroots advocacy mobilization for Oxfam America for more than a dozen years, including the creation of a national grassroots advocacy training program with teams in 15 US cities. So over to you, Brian.
Caroline, thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to this session. I'm extremely excited to be able to present briefly and then to hear from our panel. I'm going to share slides, which you should be able to see now. I also want to kick off with a question for you. I want all of you, and by the way, please do feel free to turn on your cameras. It's more fun and interactive for us as speakers to see you. But I want to start with a question for you. Think of a time that you heard about someone's situation in such a way that it moved you and made you want to take action. And I want you to think back on that. What do you remember? Do you remember something about the person in that situation? Do you remember something about the feelings that it raised in you? Any particular images? If so, chances are that what you heard or what moved you was more than an argument of logic, more than data, more than facts. Chances are it was a story. So stories have unique ability to move us from facts to feelings to action. But how do we do them? How do we bring them into our work? We're going to hear from some incredible panelists today. I just want to open with a couple of brief questions to keep in mind. Why do stories affect us differently? What makes a story a story? How do we build story into our work? So first of all, why do they affect us differently? Briefly, this is a very busy slide. I'm going to summarize. We see that stories affect our brains differently. Neural coupling means that we hear the other person's experience as though it was our own. So there's empathy. Mirroring means that our brain activity is similar to that we see in the brains of other listeners, as well as the storyteller. So the story really is a shared experience. And that makes a big difference for me when I think about why I do the work I do. When I was 20, I was in El Salvador on a solidarity trip. I heard so many stories from so many people, and I carried that with me. I remember them to this day, and it made a big impact in the career choice and the life choice that I chose. So we have empathy with neural coupling. We have a shared experience through mirroring. we have an emotional impact, which releases neurotransmitters like dopamine. And what that means is that our brain encodes the information better. We remember more vividly what we heard when there's story. And finally, there's cortex activity. More of our brain lights up when there's a story. So one interesting study looked at descriptive language versus vivid images and metaphor. Descriptive language that was basically processed in the fact processors of our brain. So for example, the singer had a pleasing voice. The fact part of our brain processed. The singer had a velvet voice. That activated the sensory cortex, a different part of the brain. Similarly, he had strong hands versus he had leathery hands. So those images really matter. Those details matter that we hear in our stories. The takeaway here is that we're wired for stories as human beings and that they activate our heads and our hearts. And when it comes to social impact, this is really important because the heart aspect gives us our why, that motivation. The head part gives us our how we're going to deal with a situation. And stories can help us overcome emotional blockers to action. So to move people from inertia to action, from fear to hope, right? From isolation to solidarity. Stories can help us get over that and into action. All right, so what makes a story? Because we're natural storytellers. Probably when you're talking with your friends, you go into story mode, but at work, we typically don't do it, and it can even feel unnatural. Why is that? Well, it can help to look at what makes a story. Let's take a look at the three little pigs. If we took a typical, reporting human rights approach, what might that look like? Take a look at the slide here. Does this look familiar? I see other panelists laughing, right? Chances are, this is how most of us would communicate the story of the three little pigs. I'm venturing to guess. We're trained this way in all of our schooling to start with a thesis and provide supporting evidence, logical argument. So it's helpful to look at the convention of story so we can start to isolate that and try it. Stories have a person, a character at the center, in this case, the pigs. And those characters or character faces a challenge. The big bad wolf wants to eat them. And in the face of this challenge, they make choices. So the first pig chose not to take the threat seriously and just slapdash throw a house together with straw. And there's an outcome for that choice. The big bad wolf huffs, puffs, blows the house down, and that little pig has to run to his brother's house. Now that brother also made a choice to procrastinate, to throw together a house with shoddy materials of wood, sticks. Outcome, house is blown down by the bad wolf. The two pigs have to run to their brother's house, okay? That brother also made a choice to take the threat seriously, to use sensible materials, and to put to work early building a house of brick. And the outcome there, of course, they don't get eaten. So in great storytelling, you'll see there's a choice outcome interplay. Often it's the choices fail and fail and fail, and the situation gets worse and worse until finally it turns around, and that outcome is what teaches us an important lesson. So when we look at social change work, how can we apply this? Well, who's your character? Are you talking about a community? What we see is that talking about a single person has more impact on the brain. Even having two people as your main character reduces that ability to have that neural coupling, that empathy. So who might you be singling out as your subject? What's the challenge they face, right? If a mining company comes into town and disrupts their land, their way of life, their way of income, there's a challenge. What's the choice the character makes in the face of that? Do they start to work for the company? And what's the outcome there? Do they band together with their community members? What's the outcome there? Do they defend their land rights? What's the outcome there? And with social impact work, one of the powers of the story is it gives us a moral to take away. We as humans, we are choiceful agents. We make choices. And the story tells us some very important information. Who are we in the face of this challenge? What are the values that bring us together and guide our action? Values like justice, human rights, land rights, community, solidarity. What is the value that's giving us power to act? And then what are the choices that we face, the actions we can take? All of this is communicated in story. So incorporating story into our work, and by the way, some of the information on this slide comes from the work of Marshall Gans, And there's a lot of interesting trainings out there that are provided, including through the Leading Change Network from Marshall Gans and so on. But the point I want you to take away is this: none of us can become good storytellers on our own. The only way we can do it is by telling it to others and getting feedback from them. What resonates? What images come across to them? Right? What lands well? And just continue to get feedback and try it out. And that's how we'll go about it. So with the last question here, how can we incorporate this into our work? I encourage folks to start looking for opportunities to move from reporting mode to story mode. Reports have an issue focus, whereas stories are about people or a person. Reports take a system-wide view. Stories will take a personal point of view. Reports, we make our main point up front, that thesis. Of stories build suspense and reveal at the end. And what perhaps most importantly, reports explain and stories show. They illustrate. The more we can paint pictures and provide images and sensory details, the more we're activating all those different elements of the brain and making a larger impact there. So I'll end with these questions for folks to reflect on as we hear from our panelists and as you go forward in your work, hearing stories and trying them yourself. Who is telling the story? Who is gaining voice as a storyteller? That's so important in terms of empowerment. Who is the hero of the story? Who is depicted as the subject who's making the choices, who has agency? Is it a member of a global NGO, or is it a member of a local community? These choices make a big difference. What gives us our power? Stories call us to action based on a guiding value. What is that value that's at the center of the story that perhaps you're telling? Solidarity, justice, knowledge. And finally, what gives us hope? So often our stories are about the hardship, kind of the nightmare of what folks are facing now. Stories also should include a kernel of hope, that vision that we can achieve if we act together. So I want to now turn it over to our panelists. I encourage you to not only listen today and learn and ask us questions at the end, but also continue to tell your story, continue to tell stories and get feedback. And let's continue to have stories make an impact in the work that we do for human rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. This was incredible first presentation. Thank you very much. All those great elements of what makes a story. And I'm quite sure that none of us will never see the Three Little Pigs story the same way. Thanks so much. We will now hear from Michael Clements. Michael is the head of programs at Lawyers for Human Rights, a South African public interest legal organization. She previously managed Lawyers for Human Rights Environmental Rights Program and worked in private practice as an attorney for a Wall Street firm prior to that. She holds a BA from Bogrand College and received her law degree from Columbia University School of Law. So over to you, Michael.
Thanks so much, Caroline, and thanks, Brian, for that amazing kickoff. I'm hopefully going to pick up right where you left off. As Caroline said, I'm the head of programs at Lawyers for Human Rights, which is one of South Africa's largest and oldest public interest legal organizations. So we were just talking beforehand, and if I look a little less bright-eyed and bushy-tailed than my amazing fellow panelists, you'll forgive me. It's the end of the day here in Johannesburg. But as a bit of background before I jump into the details of the stories that I'm going to highlight, at Lawyers for Human Rights, the core of our work is, unsurprisingly, often litigation and legal advocacy. And in the South African context, our work around business and human rights often centers on the extractive industry. That won't be a surprise to anyone here, but obviously given the very large role that the sector has played in South Africa, in the economy, but also in society at large, and I'll speak a little bit more about that now. The opportunities for rights violations and infringements by that sector are obviously therefore also numerous. And this has, I think, kind of pushed us to be more creative and to think more in a more nuanced way around the advocacy that we do with and on behalf of the communities that we serve. And the need to elevate the voices of those that are impacted by these rights violations to the very top of the discussions and debates that we are often in is kind of always front of mind for us. I can say confidently that we've never been aware, I think, as we are today, of the fact that winning in a courtroom, when we do, is rarely enough to fully address the power asymmetry between corporations and affected communities that really lies at the heart of many of the kind of fundamental conflicts between business and human rights. And all of us, of course, in this session will be well of that. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that now in reflecting on an article that we wrote together with Maria Isabel Cubires of FIDH, and which originally emerged out of our work on behalf of a community called Blayfor here in South Africa. And I'm going to share some slides shortly on that, but the story of Blayfor is itself an interesting one. And it came to our attention as lawyers about 5 years ago through a pretty simple request from a big community for help with access to water, which had kind of been quite unceremoniously shut off. So we quickly brought urgent litigation to restore access to water, thought that kind of done and dusted. But what was revealed in our continued conversations with the community was that there were much bigger issues at play here around the end of the business cycle in general. And what human rights obligations the extractive industry may have to communities that have grown up around and really relied on these companies for decades in the context of mine closure. I'm gonna try and share my screen now, but I see that my connection is unstable, so I'll rely on my fellow panelists to tell me if there's any problem with hearing me. Looks like I'm freezing a little bit. So maybe I'll just keep chatting, no slides. The Blayfor mine had basically operated for about 7 decades, so almost 70 years. And it operated not only as a mine, but also effectively as the state. So in addition to providing the kind of main employment opportunities for this area, it also provided all basic services. It distributed and maintained houses for the community, supported schools, medical clinics, etc. And then in kind of 2013, it suddenly initiated liquidation proceedings. And basically, as it was experienced by the surrounding community, it closed its gates and doors overnight. That resulted, thank you, Caroline, that's great. Perfect. In a municipality in which the mine was located, basically revealing that it was unable or unwilling to kind of take up its role under the Constitution to act as the state for the community that was left behind in this kind of post-liquidation scenario. What that meant was that the community was left facing kind of not only mass unemployment, but also threatened termination of all basic services, infrastructure breakdowns, massive environmental degradation, and other quite severe human rights consequences. And there was kind of no one to turn to say, who can help us fix this as a community? Why did it happen? As I mentioned, the company had functioned for so long as a kind of mini state that when the company decided to declare bankruptcy or had to declare bankruptcy, it meant that there was no one to step into the shoes of the state. The state simply wasn't prepared to do that. Now, at that time, as I think a lot of you will recall, the concept of human rights due diligence was really gathering a lot of steam. And I think it probably affected a lot of our work. So there was a lot of discussions about the idea of due diligence at the start of extractive projects and development projects. The mandate for the UN Working Group to consider the developments of the Business and Human Rights Treaty was kicking off, obviously building on the UN guiding principles and its focus on due diligence and so forth. So this was a big topic. And at the same time, in South Africa, the Department of Mineral Resources had announced that they thought that there was over 6,000 abandoned mines in the country. So where instead of a proper mine closure process, the old owners of those operations had, as in the case of Blayfor, simply walked away. So it felt urgent to begin unpacking what this might mean for presumably some 6,000 mining communities surrounding these abandoned mines, and to begin to bring those situations more formally into the dialogues and discussions around human rights due diligence at all stages of the business cycle and not just at the beginning of these projects. So we started to look around. And in doing a review of that landscape, we came across another mining village called Durban Deep, and located effectively just down the road from the Blayfor mine village, where we saw replication of those same human rights issues that we saw at Blayfor, but perhaps to an even more extreme degree. So this is a community that existed at the landscape, at the intersection of kind of operating mines and a lot of abandoned mining properties. And the physical landscape that surrounded the community was really striking. It was kind of dominated by old mine buildings and abandoned headgear, largely stripped of anything valuable. Some of the women that we ultimately interviewed spoke about the really spooky skyline at night that was created by the abandoned mining infrastructure, and the fact that there was no electricity in this area. Families had kind of banded together. They were living in old mine hostels or informal settlements. Raw sewage was and is everywhere. And there were regularly kind of huge lines of people around water tanks whenever the trucks contracted by the municipality would deem fit to arrive. And there was kind of no clear schedule around that. So you can imagine the massive hygiene risks. Violent crime, as it was at the time in Blayfor, was a regular feature of life in those areas. At that point, as Lawyers for Human Rights, we started to contemplate writing an article, which was ultimately published in a collection of essays that was edited by Jenna Martin and Karen Bravo and Tara Van Ho, called When Business Harms Human Rights. And the intention of that piece was really to draw parallels between these communities in order to call attention to what felt like would be quite a damning picture of the systemic marginalization that many communities, having grown up in and around these major mining operations, would experience in the aftermath of the closure of those operations. But it felt critically important to us that the narrative be woven and explained in the words and the terms of the affected communities themselves, rather than by us as activists and legal advocates. And so we started interviewing anyone who would talk to us, and the stories really did start to pour out. I think quite quickly, though, we sort of had a sense that we were hearing stories of these extraordinary impacts, but from one perspective, and that was the men in each community. And while the stories were incredibly powerful and deserved airtime, I think we all know that the impacts of mining, including closure, can be experienced differently and in more by women than men in those exact same situations. So I won't go into why that is. I think we all know this, and it's been well canvassed. But on that basis, we started to make a really concerted effort to draw out the voices and experiences of women and the stories that they wanted to tell in their words. And the stories were different than we had been able to obtain in our initial investigations. There's a slide that's kind of where I pulled out some of the quotes, but the women that we interviewed spoke extremely compellingly about the kind of dissolution of family and of community bonds in the chaos of these post-closure scenarios, the challenges of basic hygiene and the dignity that was eroded when you have to use a field, the dangers to their physical safety. And that's something that had been highlighted by men in their telling of their stories as well. But what was interesting was the way that the women went further. And they discussed what it had meant for their emotional and their psychological well-being to live amongst this kind of violence. And then they also spoke deeply and extensively about what living in those circumstances meant practically for their homes. They'd gone from, kind of keeping homes and families and house in a kind of well-established village to not being able to save food because the area was overrun by rats. They spoke about taking children to clinics for stomach cramps, where nurses admonished them for letting their kids drink unclean water. And they spoke about having to just clean constantly because of a fine white powder that floated in from the unrehabilitated tailings dams, and it kind of settled on every surface, beds, kitchens, it was baked into their food, etc. And those perspectives, I think, once drawn out, were not only enormously powerful, but they also allowed us to really understand and present a more nuanced and robust picture of the human rights consequences of closure. I'm going to close. I'm mindful of time, but I think for us in this process, a few concluding observations. The first, and this is, I think, an obvious one, but there is so much power and dignity in telling your own story and controlling your own narrative. And I think others are going to speak to this in the next couple of presentations, but we really saw this in this case with these two communities, which particularly in the case of Blayfor empowered the community itself to advocate for its own rights in that process. And I think, you know, the other thing that we saw, I mean, it was a sort of unintended, an unintended consequence, but we were using the language of rights when we were asking questions, and we saw that reflected back over time. The communities began to look at their own circumstances through the lens of human rights, and the legal literacy that developed as a result, I think, has been incredibly powerful when it comes to when those communities sit down at negotiating tables and engage with decision makers. And then finally, and again, this will be spoken about in more detail, I think, in the coming presentations, but it was an incredibly powerful way to build empathy and points of connection in a place like South Africa that can be extremely divided on some of these issues. As Brian spoke about, it's a really different thing to hear from a mother who's talking about being yelled at by a nurse for letting her child drink water when that was the only water around, as opposed to the legal argument about why clean water is essential. I'm going to pause there, and I'm sorry, my screen seems totally frozen. So I'm going to hand over to Caroline and hope that works. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was perfect, and we could hear you very, very well. And thanks for all those very rich insights with those two cases, super interesting cases, and we look forward to the exchanges after. We will move directly to Andrew Bogrand. Andrew is a human rights and climate campaigner who supports nonprofit coalitions and communities fighting injustices. Currently, he's a senior policy advisor with Oxfam's Global Extractive Industries team. Previously, he held roles with Democracy International and Human Rights Watch. Andrew has defended activists, conducted human rights research, and organized media campaigns in challenging and conflict environments. So over to you, Andrew.
Well, thanks so much, Caroline. And it's really an honor to be asked to speak, and I hope I can. We want to talk a little bit about East Africa today, and hopefully can do it justice. I don't know if I'm necessarily the best presenter, but I wanted to share some of the reflections that we've learned at Oxfam, and a little bit about where I think this work is going, and some takeaways that have influenced my own work. And I've sat at the kind of intersection of policy and communications, so I kind of have some thoughts and reflections on that. I would like to share my screen here, and I thought I could start with just a brief review of this campaign and what we've called Down the Line, and it's Oxfam's campaign on oil in East Africa. And I thought today, this is a shot from Lake Albert that we took with a drone, very near actually where the oil was discovered in 2006, a long time ago. But French company Total, along with others, are moving to build this pipeline, which you see here in the map. And you know, this Oxfam has walked with these communities now for 3-4 years, probably longer in some areas. And if this pipeline project moves forward, it will be one of the longest heated pipelines in the world. It's a massive project covering 2 countries. And more importantly, lots of families in between Lake Albert and the Indian Ocean, and it's immensely destabilizing and extremely concerning from a rights perspective in particular. And kind of Oxfam's anchor product with this was this community-based human rights impact assessment, and reflecting hundreds of interviews again along this pipeline route, what people were concerned about, what they wanted from the project, and what the risks were for the project developers. And kind of our challenge as both an extractives team and also working with Oxfam's private sector team was to turn this really dense human rights research into kind of a public campaign in a way that we could motivate and inspire action along the route and further afield, with companies that were involved, not just Total, the project developer, but its subsidiaries and contractors and governments, of course. So it was this kind of project we jumped into about 3 years ago, and it's carried us forward. We're still very much, I think, on the front lines, walking with our partners and with these communities. And COVID has impacted this effort immensely. It's been a challenge because of the remoteness of many of the families and the remoteness and the challenge of access has proven difficult. But I think we've persevered, and I'm excited. We're looking at taking this media project to kind of another level in the coming year. With that, I might take a pause here and share a video that we produced, which in addition to the impact assessment was another kind of anchor product that we produced in conjunction again with folks along the route. So this is just a minute, and it's just kind of the trailer, as it were, for Down the Line. We play it here.
We can't see it at the moment, Andrew.
Not playing? Okay, let me try again here. See if this works. Excellent. All right, here, we'll go back to the presentation. All right, so that was the kind of the trailer for the video that we produced. And what I liked most about it was, we put together a lot of resourcing, but it was very, very locally driven. And you saw the kind of the graffiti artist that we partnered with, the musician, the drone shots, all of this were done in Uganda and with really local and fantastic talent. There were a number of challenges putting together this video and the research that we had to address. The first was just the very realistic security issues, and that's one that I think that we have to keep front in mind when we put people on camera. In this case, we had kind of what we called 4 hero speakers. You saw a few of them in their settings: a farmer, a fisher, and here's our narrator, Ben. And all of these folks, did face security risks. And so we had to frame this project in a way that was forward-looking. And someone mentioned hope-based, and that's kind of the strategy we used, not to focus so much on the violations, but on what people wanted and how we moved it forward. The other challenge is, of course, the communications, just the language barrier itself was extensive. We talk about 2 countries where Swahili and Luganda, not English, are the primary languages, but also a lot of folks that needed to speak English and French internationally. And then many of the communities that we work with, some are indigenous and do not spoke, different languages, especially around the Albertine region. So that presented another challenge. The other is, of course, overcoming this existing narrative from oil companies. And that was part of our mandate, was to push back on this narrative that this oil project was essentially going to be good for both Uganda and Tanzania, to at least complicate what was a very kind of pro-development, pro-oil narrative. And then there was just the campaigning aspect itself, bringing legitimacy, bringing community voice to a very kind of geopolitically complex issue, and really bringing all of this research and all of this work to life, and kind of reflecting what was a very dense report into a little bit more accessible broad-based public campaign. And we started that down here, you'll see with a roundtable, a creative roundtable in Kampala. And one thing that I've learned doing this work a little bit is that these roundtables, they work. That getting people to circle around, put their ideas on the table is super effective. And I wanted to, this is a quote from Vanessa Nakate, who's a Ugandan climate activist. That's not actually her on the right. This is Alice, who was a women's rights campaigner, and she was featured in our video and in our reporting. But I love this quote from Vanessa, and it's something that also Alice reflected, which is that, there's these really critical stories, really intense stories, and they're not told. She lived, this is in a village that's maybe 2 miles from where there's massive oil exploration. She was resettled herself, and she has a real story to tell. Her husband left, was kind of took literal oil money and left her family, and it was really a tough moment in her life, but she was really excited to share the story, share her thoughts on what to do, on what companies could do, and what she had experienced. And I think that it gets to this point around the value of media representation, that it matters, and getting, making sure that, I think NGOs are at this moment where we have to take a back seat. And if we are the story, we're doing it wrong. And I think that's something that we're really exploring with at Oxfam, and that's really letting go of power, recognizing that when NGOs want to communicate, they have a lot of resources to do so, and focusing a lot more on what I think there's some writing on this around bridging capacity. That's we worked with someone who's done Hollywood videos and Hollywood TV, but he wasn't there to create his version of the story. He was there to essentially boost power of local talent. And so here's our musician Haka that we filmed, and Fred, one of our graffiti artists, who had different themes from the report that we did in graffiti. Land was of course a core one, as well as money and the environment. And so it was fun. It was fun to explore kind of different ways that we can utilize these kind of creative inputs. The other kind of takeaway that I've learned that's been really, really difficult is the importance of language. And I think it's often overlooked in communications. Everyone always wants to cut translation services, and just getting down to brass tacks. I think it's incredibly useful and essential that people be able to speak in their own voice and in a language they're comfortable speaking with. I've been in too many interviews where the videographer, someone wants to use English or French, and that's just not maybe someone's first language. And I think what's really important about this is that actually this quote, empty promises, was what we titled the report, and used it quite extensively in interviews and across our assets. But this idea of empty promises came from an interview that we used in the video. And it came to kind of one of my other kind of hope takeaways, which is that using this creative process, I think you can, and becoming more authentic in the interviews allows for representation that otherwise wouldn't happen. And so we couldn't translate empty promises in English. She was doing the interview in Ugandan, but it came through really powerful. And so we ended up using that, of course, with her permission and kind of an input. The last here, and I realize that in time I'll cut up here. But the power of the right shot, power of the perfect shot. Obviously here we're talking about video and media, but I think this goes to a bigger story about storytelling, which is that these media products are often done in isolation. And as someone who's seen their effectiveness from a policy position, I think that stories can be really effective. Sometimes companies are perfectly fine with a report, but when that report's turned into a 4 or 5 minute video, they're much less comfortable with the reality, even though the story is exactly the same. But the way that it's told, the way that people are telling it, can have a real impact. And we've learned that at Oxfam with this project. I think a lot of our public campaigning on this has bolstered the policy impact of the report and helped us secure kind of corporate and other sort of hard policy wins through compelling creative collaboration with different comms teams and public engagement folks. I'll stop there. These these are two of my good friends, Eric on the right there and Oscar on the left, the drone guy and one of our videographers I've worked with in the car we've taken around Uganda. But again, it's a pleasure to speak and hopefully answer some questions here. And just really want to end on the idea of the importance of community narratives, which Michael was talking about previous, and the importance of, I think, building power, bridging capacity to build power, because there are massive asymmetries of power that we face. And I think communications and media is one tool to overcome that if it's done in the right way, and if it's done in a compelling kind of story-driven way. So I'll stop there, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you so much, Andrew. This was amazing presentation. Thanks for sharing your lessons learned and key takeaways and collecting those stories. Love how you're trying to boost powers of local talents. This is really, and I think we see this in this film, and I'll never get tired of watching down the line this video. We can put the link in the chat so that people can look at the complete video. And we will go directly with our last but not least speaker, Paul Redman, who's a multi-award winning documentary director, social impact strategic communicator who has traveled the world creating campaign videos, investigative exposes, and participatory media for over 20 years. He's the founder and executive director at If Not Us, Then Who. Paul has trained local activists across 3 continents and uses storytelling techniques to amplify and empower new leaders. His work has featured in several major news outlets. He was recently awarded the 2020 Pongo Award from the Orangutan Republic Foundation for his work. So over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Wow, I want to have you introducing me in all the meetings that I have to go into. That's amazing. Thank you. So just to say, yeah, resonating very closely with everybody was saying about the need for participatory media as an empowerment tool, and the basis is sharing skills and amplifying sort of diverse stories. And so I guess I'll talk a bit about If Not Us, Then Who, which is the organization that I'm executive director at the moment of. And it's an Indigenous-led strategic communications initiative to bring Indigenous peoples who have been, and local communities who've been left out of climate decision-making into that space. And we do and enable that through participatory media production and event organizing, which is all centered around very much a storytelling basis. And when we say storytelling, it's super participatory. It's in consultation. It involves and includes elements of training and equipping local people to tell their own stories. And our overarching kind of approach to this work is to take the perception of Indigenous peoples and local communities as being victims in climate catastrophe to being heroes in the battle to mitigate against climate change. And that's where story is uniquely powerful, because you can really, get to the emotional truth or the heart of the story. And that can connect and bring in decision makers, as Andrew was saying before. That 5-minute film really cuts through all the information and gets decision makers at a table where they can read those amazing reports and pull in the data. But it's about setting the stage so people can feel the issue before they get involved in intellectually understanding it and want to sort of solve it. And so we very much work in that space. I'm going to just show a very quick video, which is kind of a rough oversight of some of the stuff that we're doing. And then, yeah, I'll talk a bit more about it. So let's hope the share screen works. Desktop 2, share. As you can see, a big fan of video. I love it. Hang on, how do I get out of this? Right, hang on. There we go, stop share. Just really powerful, I think, images, and there's not much speaking in that, but there's, normally we would do documentaries are led by the indigenous peoples who are featured in the film, so it's all done in their voice. And so I guess just to talk through some of the process of how we do this is at the very beginning is talking. So talking with indigenous leaders and understanding what the messages and stories that they want to get out are, and then helping them to frame that in the climate crisis, you know, in the wording and the language that is being used in climate conferences and events. And so it starts with a dialogue, and then a site visit from us, or increasingly during COVID, pre-COVID, by the indigenous and local community filmmakers who we train and equip in remote regions. And so, you know, we have historically, or I have historically gone to villages, and we've gone, I think, to 36 different villages to create these short 5-minute films. But the future is not that, right? The future is giving equipment, giving the commissions to local filmmakers. And so the majority of our work now is doing that. As it was in the past, but with COVID, we have the virtual space where I think which is a beautiful opportunity to really train people so we don't have to travel. And so it starts off with a dialogue, and then we go with that community and film what's going on through their voices. And so we speak to a diverse range of community members, and this is where video is great, because you can speak to the youth, you can speak to women, the elders, the men, really capture, you know, the full range of the community, and then through that make films which is an aggregate of all of those stories. So it is the emotional truth of everybody in that village, you know, and then you get a real emotional accuracy, you know, to what's being said. It's not one person's perspective, and so it's very exciting in that process to do that. And then once we have the film, the rough cuts are agreed, the call to actions in the films are agreed by the community, so they in many ways see and are empowered by their own stories. You know, when you interview somebody, they might talk for 60 minutes, but in a 5-minute film they have 30 seconds, and so you're showing them back to themselves in a very concise and clear storytelling way. And so that is empowering for those leaders, and then to be able to see those 5-minute films and see the impact they have on decision makers, and the films are in their voice with their call to action. Like, all of that stuff is super empowering for local communities to witness and to be engaged in. And so we've, I guess, used that as the foundational work of all the different media products that we put out. And so it also gives the product's legitimacy. And then I guess for us, the next stage is like, how do we get these stories out and in front of decision makers? And so a lot of what we do there is to improvise stages for the people featured in the films, or the leaders featured in the films, to step onto those stages and meet decision makers and influencers face to face. And so I think that's really important, that not only are you going to the village or getting people to record in the village, you're also saying to those leaders, well, come to the conference now, and here's a stage you can speak on. And this is a framework that, you know, that might resonate with people if you think this is, you know, the right framework to be under. And so like really creating these stages where you combine the feeling of it all, the music, the art, the media, the creativity, the culture, the cultural aspect of it all, I think, you know, which is really how local people see their community, not necessarily in the sort of binary kind of black and white data-driven ways that you know, historically we see it, right? It's very much a cultural and emotional landscape that we all exist in. So they bring those into the climate conference and allow them to have those stages that are that diverse cultural space. And I think through these stages, you develop comfort from these leaders in speaking at international conferences. And so through that, and through all of this, you know, creating this in a participatory way, I think what we've seen through our networks is a huge growth of understanding from community to community through the media products, a huge growth of like networks working together, because the stages or the events that we put on, we're bringing in allies and decision makers to meet face to face with leaders. And so leaders are getting new allies and new networks to help to amplify their stories. And so, yeah, I guess participatory media, participatory events really for me is a very exciting space to explore, you know, because it's very much, you know, yes, it has core amazing data at its center, but it also has emotion and culture at its center. And that's who we are as humans. And so like participatory media, participatory events, I think need to be like an integral part of sort of people's long-term strategy going forward, because it's the only way I can see to bridge the gap from local to global, and to take that that sort of victim or that other and bring it into a heroic narrative. And I guess the one final thing is to say that what's beautiful about it in another way is that young people who are filming in their own communities are now seeing the heroes in their own community, and holding a camera and pointing it at your community does that. And so what you're creating is a connection to rural spaces, a connection to local communities through the process of making the video. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, all I had to say on this subject. I love the process. I think the process is super important, as important as the end product itself. And if we're building strategies to do participatory communication, make that center to it all, right? Really build it from local aspirations. Yeah, we have a load of films. You're welcome to watch them online. Yeah, and that was it from my side of things.
Thank you so much, Paul. This was excellent. It was very great. Thanks for sharing all those ingredients for a powerful product that empower people, and so they can become heroes, right? Heroes from their community. Love that. I would turn it directly to Brian. I think you raised some great question at the beginning, and you probably have some good question also that you wanted to ask our partners or our participants, or some reflections you wanted to share.
Thank you so much. Yes, so I think we have about 5 minutes, maybe a tad less. And we have a question that's come through in the chat, and I'd like to go directly to participant questions. For Paul, we have, how do you decide which communities to film or visit? And I would welcome our other panelists to chime in as well. Paul.
Yeah, my side of things, right? Yeah, we work very closely with our funders in that space, Ford Foundation, Climate and Land Use Alliance, and others who support amazing work on the ground. And so yeah, just conversations with people who work in the areas, and then the leaders themselves. And so we work with some broad indigenous networks. In fact, our decision making is led by them. And so we ask them, you know, what are the best stories that show climate solutions on the ground, and that really helps us to guide it. And then I guess put in my storytelling documentary filmmaker lens into that, and try kind of get a good spread of stories across the countries. And so, yeah, it's talking and asking local networks and local peoples.
Got it. Other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. One theme that I noticed here coming through so strongly was the idea that it's really, folks are practicing going beyond just going and gathering stories, extracting stories, and really creating space for folks to step forward and take the stage. I'm curious whether other panelists want to speak to how did you choose where to start? Take us to creating that first connection with community members and trying to initiate the process of moving from your gathering their story to actually them being the storyteller.
Sorry, was that a general question, or I was gonna...
Yeah, I wanted to see if Andrew or Michael would like to chime in on that.
Yeah, I think your point about extractivism on extractive projects. I mean, I think that there is an issue that historically, I think, again, the bigger INGO community has kind of gone in, gone out, and used these stories for global media. They often haven't thought about the local impact. That's at a very basic level from like a security perspective, but also, I mean, a much more fundamental one around how the stories are used and how they impact change and inspire change and reflect cultures and people. And I think it's a really difficult process. But I think what I would say in terms of how to do it more effectively is to ensure that people are with you all the way through the process. So through the editing, through the design, through the creation. I mean, I think that's, to Paul's point about participatory media, I mean, I think that gets at the crux of it. And it even goes beyond. I think that people are excited to share the stories as well. And a lot of times I think groups are so focused on putting them into different channels that they don't think about, letting the storytellers themselves tell their own story and share their own story. So that's some things that I picked up.
Maybe I'll pop in, Brian, and just to add on to what Andrew and Paul have said. Obviously, as lawyers, we're kind of creatures of instruction. So often clients will reach out to us with rights issues that we try and deal with in courts. But I think something that really spoke to me, Andrew, you said it about kind of letting go of power, and Paul, you echoed it. And I think that's been a real learning for our legal sector in the South African context, and I think globally as well. And kind of trying to release our agendas and our ideas of change and the kind of conception of social justice that we want to see, and being driven instead by the vision of the communities that we represent, and the sort of idea of movement lawyering and taking our lead absolutely from our clients rather than vice versa has been something that is, I think, increasingly informed the way that we engage and represent our community clients. So just echoing very much your beautiful turn of phrase about letting go of power in the spaces that we use for advocacy. Thanks.
Just to throw something in there, I think what's exciting is we live in a sort of very democratic, in some ways, in other ways not obviously, but a very democratic age where everybody has a phone at their disposal, right? And the internet with which to share that information. And so like it's a very short step from like, engaging in an issue to getting really exciting media content that can influence change. And you talk about the George Floyd murder being a prime example of video advocacy, which was just a smartphone being pointed at policemen, right, arresting a black man. And so like that changed society. We can, and every single one of our constituents who we work with can enact that sort of change at a global level. It's super straightforward, right? It's not complicated.
I often think about that teenager who, instead of walking away or doing something else, she pulled out her smartphone and she filmed that George Floyd murder, and thus sparked that entire social upheaval and dynamic. So we are at time, I'm sorry to say, because I would love to keep going. To borrow a phrase one of our speakers shared, we looked at how stories can overcome asymmetries of power. And for me, the takeaway is sharing stories and sharing space and sharing the stage is sharing power. So I encourage everyone who was in the session today to use what you learned here, to take it to folks you work with, and encourage to using this storytelling practice even more in our human rights work. Thank you so much, everybody. Carolyn, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much, Andrew, Paul, and Michael. This was an amazing panel. I just wish we could go for another hour listening to all those stories, but also those strategies and those lessons learned and all the takeaways that we could collect from your experiences and those, the richness of those experiences. So I hope that you all have enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. And please feel free to reach out if you have any question or want to discuss this further.